They burned my Harley, Caleb said quietly, his voice carrying no rage, no trembling, just a stillness that was worse than either. Everything Hannah and I built together, reduced to ash on a Saturday morning. He turned to look at the man who'd delivered the warning. Tell Adrian Voss I said thank you. The man blinked. For what? Caleb's pale blue eyes didn't waver. For reminding me exactly who I am. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and follow this story all the way to the end and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The first hammer swing happened at 9:47 on a Saturday morning. Caleb Morgan was inside Morgan Custom Cycles when he heard it, not the impact itself, but the sound that followed. A hollow metallic groan that traveled through the shop walls the way bad news travels through a small town, fast, unmistakable, and impossible to unhear once it reaches you. He set down the torque wrench in his hand. He didn't rush. He'd learned long ago that the moments worth rushing toward were the ones that required you to be slow. He walked to the front door and pushed it open. 4 men stood around his 1969 Harley Davidson. They were masked, dressed in dark work clothes, and they moved with the practiced confidence of men who'd done this kind of thing before and suffered no consequence for it. One held a crowbar, one held a length of chain, 2 held hammers, and they were already swinging. The crowd on the sidewalk had stopped moving. 16, maybe 20 people frozen in place with their Saturday morning coffee cups and grocery bags, watching in the particular silence of people who understand what they're seeing but cannot process that it's real. Noah Bennett stepped out behind Caleb and said, Caleb, I see it. Caleb said, we should call us. I said, I see it, Noah. He walked across the pavement and stopped 10 feet from the motorcycle. One of the men glanced up from his work. The others kept swinging. The headlight shattered. The chrome fender buckled. The fuel tank took a direct blow from the crowbar and the metal caved in with a sound like a gunshot. Caleb stood with his hands at his sides. He did not shout, he did not move, he did not beg. The man with the chain wrapped it twice around the leather seat, the original hand-stitched seat, the one Caleb had rebuilt with Hannah, sitting beside him in the garage. In the last year of her life, her oxygen tank propped against the workbench, her fingers tracing the stitching, because she said she wanted to know every part of the machine that would carry him after she was gone. The chain pulled and the seat tore apart. Someone in the crowd said, oh my God. Someone else said, somebody call the police. Nobody moved to stop it. The man with the crowbar straightened and looked at Caleb directly. Even through the mask, there was something almost disappointed in his posture, the posture of a man who had expected a reaction and wasn't getting one. You know why we're here, the man said. Caleb said nothing. This shop sits on land Mr. Voss needs. You've been asked politely. You've been given a generous offer. You've been warned through proper channels. He gestured at the motorcycle. Consider this the next level of that conversation. Caleb looked at the Harley. The tank was leaking fuel now. It spread across the pavement in a dark pool that caught the morning light. You're going to want to step back, the man said. He pulled a lighter from his jacket. The flame caught. He dropped it. The fuel ignited with a sound like a breath being taken away, and the Harley, the machine that Caleb and Hannah had rebuilt together over 16 months, the machine that represented the only perfect thing they had ever made with their hands, became fire. The crowd on the sidewalk moved backward. Some covered their mouths. A woman near the coffee shop doorway put her hand over her heart and turned away. Caleb didn't move. He stood in the heat and watched it burn. The man with the crowbar stepped close enough that his voice dropped below the noise of the crowd. Sell the shop by Monday, he said, or next time we burn everything. The shop, the inventory, all of it. He paused. Mr. Voss doesn't like waiting. Caleb reached into the left pocket of his work jeans and removed an old steel lighter. It was worn smooth with decades of handling, the kind of object that becomes an extension of the hand that carries it. On its side was an engraved symbol, a winged skull, simple and worn nearly flat with age. He turned it once in his fingers. He did not open it. He did not use it. He simply held it for a moment, then returned it to his pocket. The man with the crowbar looked at it. He didn't recognize what he was seeing. He was too young, and he'd been hired for his willingness, not his knowledge. But at the edge of the crowd, an old man standing beside a battered pickup truck saw the lighter. Ray Kessler was 68 years old, and he'd been driving long-haul trucks through Wyoming for 40 years. He'd known men in his life who carried that symbol. He'd known what it meant when they carried it quietly rather than proudly. He'd understood once upon a time that the quiet ones were the ones you did not under any circumstances provoke. The color drained from Ray Kessler's face. The attackers walked away without looking back. Caleb stood before the burning motorcycle until the fire began to die on its own. The fuel spent, the flames dropping from furious to defeated. The chrome had blackened. The leather was gone entirely. What remained was a skeleton of scorched metal that still held the shape of something beautiful, the way certain ruins do. Noah came to stand beside him. The young man's face was flushed and his fists were tight at his sides, and Caleb could feel 21 years of anger radiating off him like its own kind of heat. "Tell me what to do," Noah said. His voice was low and cracked in the middle. "Just tell me what to do and I'll do it." Caleb looked at him. "Bring me the engine stand," he said. "We're rebuilding her." Noah stared at him. "Caleb, I know what they just did." His voice was steady, absolutely steady. "Bring me the engine stand." Noah went inside. Caleb remained where he was for another 30 seconds looking at what was left of the machine Hannah had touched with her hands. Then he went inside too, and he began to work. The crowd outside dispersed slowly, the way people leave the scene of something they'll be talking about for years. Murmured conversations. Phones out, photographs taken. The burned skeleton of the Harley cooling in the morning air. At the edge of the lot, Ray Kessler hadn't moved. He stood beside his truck with his hands braced against the door, his face still carrying the gray pallor of recognition. He was thinking about a number he hadn't dialed in 24 years. A number he'd kept because the man who gave it to him said, "You carry this until the day you don't need it, and if that day comes, you use it without hesitation." Ray believed that day had come. He got in the truck. He drove 2 blocks down, away from the crowd, and he pulled out his phone. He dialed. It rang 3 times. A man's voice answered, low, unhurried, carrying the particular weight of someone accustomed to conversations that matter. "Yeah," Ray said, "they burned Caleb Morgan's Harley." Silence. Not the silence of someone processing information. The silence of someone who had just arrived at a decision. "Does he know you called?" "No." "Good, keep it that way." A pause. "We're coming." The line went dead. Ray set the phone on the passenger seat and sat with his hands on the steering wheel for a long time before he drove away. Inside Morgan Custom Cycles, Caleb worked. He did not turn on the radio. He did not make phone calls. He cleared space on the engine stand, organized his tools with the quiet precision of a man who understands that controlled motion is the only honest response to chaos, and he began to assess what could be salvaged from the machine his wife had helped him build. Noah worked beside him without speaking, because he'd learned in 2 years of apprenticing under Caleb Morgan that there were conversations the man had with his hands that you didn't interrupt. By noon, they had the engine separated and on the stand. By 2 o'clock, Caleb had identified which components could be restored and which had to be sourced. By 4, he'd made 4 phone calls to parts dealers in 3 states and placed orders for everything he couldn't fabricate himself. He ate a sandwich at the workbench at 6 in the evening. He drank black coffee. He looked at the engine and thought about Hannah, and then he set the thought aside gently, the way you set aside something precious when your hands need to be free for work. Noah watched him from across the bench. "Can I ask you something?" Noah said. "You can try." "Why aren't you?" Noah stopped, started again. Any other person would be on the phone right now. Any other person would be calling, a lawyer, calling the police, calling somebody. He gestured at the engine. "You're just working." Caleb picked up a socket wrench. "I am calling somebody," he said. "Who?" "Everybody I need to call already knows." Noah didn't understand that. He stored it away the way he'd learned to store the things Caleb said that took time to become clear. Sheriff Dan Pruitt arrived at the shop at 7:45. He was a broad man in his early 50s with a careful face and the posture of someone carrying weight he hadn't originally signed up for. He'd worked in Redstone Valley for 11 years. He knew everybody. He knew Caleb the way you know a man who fixes your bike, helps your neighbor's kids, shows up for every community function, and never once asked for credit. "I've got witness statements," Pruitt said. "I've got photographs. I've got footage from 2 different business cameras." He paused. "I've also got a very strong suspicion about who sent them." "So do I," Caleb said. "Caleb, I want to move on this. But Adrian Voss has two county commissioners on speed dial and a lawyer who once got a man acquitted in federal court for something I won't describe in polite company. Pruitt looked at the scorched outline on the pavement through the shop window. If I move too early, he walks. And then you're the one who has a problem. I know that. I need time. You've got time, Caleb said. Take what you need. Pruitt looked at him for a long moment. Most men who just watch their property get destroyed would be a lot angrier than you're presenting right now. Caleb turned back to the engine. I'm not most men. No, Pruitt said quietly. I'm starting to understand that. He left. Noah had been listening from the back of the shop. When the sheriff's cruiser pulled out of the lot, he came forward. He's not going to help us, Noah said. He's going to help when it matters, Caleb said. Right now, the only thing he can do is move too fast and give Voss room to escape. So we let it breathe. And in the meantime, we work. Noah looked at his hands. He was 21 years old and he'd come to Redstone Valley 18 months ago from a situation in Laramie that he didn't talk about in detail. And Caleb had hired him on a trial basis that became permanent after the first week because the kid had the best instincts with an engine Caleb had seen in 30 years of working with his hands. Caleb had never asked about Laramie. Noah had never explained it. They'd reached an agreement the way two people sometimes do, without words, based purely on the mutual recognition that some things don't need to be excavated to be understood. What Noah understood now, watching Caleb work, was that the man he'd spent 18 months learning from was not behaving like a man who'd lost. He was behaving like a man who was waiting for something he was confident was coming. Caleb, Noah said, who are you? Caleb set down the wrench. He looked at Noah with those pale blue eyes that held a kind of clarity that had nothing to do with youth. I'm a mechanic, he said. That's not what I'm asking. Caleb picked up the wrench again. I know, he said, but that's the answer that matters right now. The night settled over Redstone Valley. The shop stayed lit until 11 when Caleb finally locked the door and walked to the small apartment above the one he'd lived in since Hannah passed, and the house on Clearwater Road became too large for one man and his memories. He stood at the window and looked down at the pavement where the Harley had burned. Then he looked further out at the dark stretch of Western Road that led past 14 properties. Adrian Voss now controlled 14 storefronts and warehouses and small businesses that had once belonged to families who'd built things here. He thought about George and Clara Simmons, who'd run the feed store for 30 years until Adrian's lawyers found a way to trigger a tax audit that lasted 14 months and cost them everything they had in savings. He thought about Pete Alvarez at the hardware store, whose supplier contracts had mysteriously vanished one by one over 6 months until Pete was buying materials at retail and couldn't compete. He thought about Donna Yeager, who'd owned the flower shop since 1989, and who'd found her front windows broken 3 mornings in a row and been told by the insurance company that a fourth claim would result in policy cancellation. They'd all sold, not happily, not willingly, but under a particular kind of pressure that leaves no obvious fingerprints, the pressure of cumulative deniable damage applied with patience and precision. Emily Carter had told Caleb about this pattern 2 months ago. She'd found it in 3 other towns across 3 other states. Adrian Voss moved slowly and methodically, and by the time any single piece of his method became visible, the property was already sold and the families were already gone. Caleb had listened to Emily's research and looked at her documents and said, he's done this before. Emily had said 14 times that I've found. How many are in the courts? 2. Both dismissed on procedural grounds. And the others? Settled, sealed, paid out quietly. Caleb had nodded. He'd understood then what he was dealing with, a man who understood the law well enough to stay just inside it and who understood human resilience well enough to know how to exhaust it. What Adrian Voss had not understood, what no one who looked at Caleb Morgan these days understood, was what had been done in the years before the shop. Caleb walked away from the window. He sat at the desk in the corner of the apartment. He pulled open the bottom drawer and reached past a stack of old repair invoices and a framed photograph of Hannah on the Wyoming State Road and found under all of that a worn leather case. Inside the case was a cell phone that had not been turned on in 4 years. He turned it on. It took 3 minutes to find a signal and pull messages from whatever ghost network it was registered to. When it finally loaded, there were 47 messages, all from the past 6 hours, all from different numbers, some across the country, some he recognized immediately, and some he'd have to think about. Every single message said some version of the same thing. We heard. We're sorry. What do you need? Caleb sat in and looked at the screen. He hadn't reached out to a single one of these men. He hadn't told anyone what happened this morning. He hadn't made one call on this phone in 4 years. Ray Kessler, he thought. Of course. He thought about the old truck driver standing at the edge of the lot and the way the color had left his face when he saw the lighter, and he almost smiled. Ray had always been perceptive. Ray had always known, even in the years when Caleb was at the center of everything, that the quiet moments were when you needed to pay closest attention. Caleb typed one message. He sent it to every number in the phone. No weapons, no threats, no revenge. He set the phone on the desk and waited. The first reply came in 40 seconds. We are not coming for revenge. We are coming so you don't stand alone. He read it twice. Then he set the phone face down and looked at the ceiling where the sound of the Wyoming wind was pressing against the roof like something patient and enormous trying to get in. He thought about Hannah, about the last conversation they'd had in the garage, her hand on the partially rebuilt Harley tank, while she told him that the life they were building in Redstone Valley was the truest version of him she'd ever seen. Not the other one, the one whose name still traveled through certain circles like a piece of dangerous weather. This one, the mechanic. The man who fixed things rather than broke them. You earned this, she'd said. This quiet. Don't let anyone take it. He'd promised her he wouldn't. He'd kept that promise for 9 years. Now a man named Adrian Voss had set fire to the last thing Hannah had touched with her hands. And 47 men, 50 now, the replies were still coming, were already moving toward Redstone Valley from 12 different states. Caleb reached across the desk and picked up the steel lighter. He turned it in his fingers once the way he had that morning. The worn, winged skull caught the lamplight. Then he set it beside Hannah's photograph. He looked at both objects for a long time. Then he turned off the lamp and went to sleep because tomorrow was Sunday and Sunday was a full day of work, and the engine wasn't going to rebuild itself, and Caleb Morgan, the mechanic, the widower, the man who fixed things, needed his hands to be steady. What they had burned was a motorcycle. What they had woken up was something else entirely. Outside, the night was still. The stars over Redstone Valley were the particular bright, sharp stars of high elevation, the kind that seem close enough to touch when the air is clear and cold. The western road was dark and empty. It would not be empty much longer. The riders were already moving. He was back at the engine stand by 6 the next morning. Noah found him there when he came in at 7, coffee in hand, still wearing the same expression he'd worn when he left the night before, the look of a young man trying to solve an equation he doesn't have all the variables for. He set a second cup on the workbench without being asked and stood beside Caleb in silence for a moment, watching him work. You sleep? Noah asked. Enough. I didn't. Noah wrapped both hands around his cup. I kept thinking about those men, the ones who did it, the way they just walked away. His jaw tightened. Like it was nothing. Like we were nothing. Caleb didn't look up from the engine. That's exactly what Adrian Voss wants you to feel. Well, it's working. Good, Caleb said. Feel it. Understand it. Then set it down and figure out what's actually useful. Noah looked at him. How are you not angry? Caleb finally stopped working. He straightened, picked up a rag, and wiped his hands with the slow deliberateness that meant he was choosing his words the same way. I am angry, he said. I've been angry since the moment I heard the first swing. He looked at Noah. But anger without direction is just fuel burning in an empty field. Doesn't move anything, doesn't build anything, just burns. He picked up the wrench again. Noah drank his coffee and thought about that for a while. The morning passed in the rhythm of work. Caleb had a transmission to finish for Dale Hutchins and a brake job on the Wainwright family's truck that had been sitting in the bay for 3 days, and he worked through both of them with the focus of a man who treats every job as the only job. Customers came and went. Several lingered longer than necessary, asking careful questions around the edges of what they really wanted to ask, which was, what are you going to do about what happened yesterday? Caleb answered every question about the motorcycle with the same quiet certainty, we're rebuilding it. Nobody asked follow-up questions. There was something in his voice that didn't leave room for them. At 11:30, Emily Carter walked through the door. She was 32 years old with long blonde hair, pulled back the way it always was when she was working, which was most of the time. She'd been the investigative reporter for the Redstone Valley Courier for 4 years. And in that time, she'd written about water rights disputes, school board corruption, and a county road contract that had redirected $500,000 to a company owned by a commissioner's brother-in-law. She was good. She was persistent in the particular way of people who came from families that had been on the losing side of systems and had decided to spend their lives learning how those systems actually worked. Her father owned the hardware store on Western Road, Pete Carter, the one whose supplier contracts had vanished one by one. She put a manila folder on Caleb's workbench. "I need you to look at something," she said. Caleb set down the wrench. He opened the folder. Inside were property transfer documents, county permit filings, 3 financial statements from Adrian Voss's development company, and a printed summary of what Emily had uncovered across 14 months of research. "He's done this in Colorado," she said. "Pueblo 2019. A 2-block stretch of family businesses acquired over 8 months. Before the acquisitions, there were 6 break-ins, 2 tax audits, 1 business wire ruled accidental, and a supplier network that stopped working with 3 of the holdout owners simultaneously." She tapped the page. "He did it in Nevada. He did it in Arizona. In every case, the pattern is identical. The timeline is identical. And in every case, every single case, the money leads back to the same 3 holding companies." Caleb looked at the documents. He turned pages, slowly reading with the focused attention of a man accustomed to assessing damage. "Any of this in front of a court?" he asked. 2 cases, both dismissed before discovery. His lawyers filed procedural motions that buried both judges in paperwork for 8 months until the plaintiffs ran out of money for legal fees. She paused. "That's also part of the pattern. What about the FBI? I filed a tip 14 months ago. I got a form letter response." She looked at him. "Caleb, I need you to understand what we're dealing with here. This isn't a local developer who got greedy. This is an organized system of property acquisition that has displaced over 200 families across 5 states. He is very good at this. He has been doing it for a long time. And the reason it keeps working is that everyone he targets is isolated. They're fighting alone with limited resources against a machine that has unlimited resources and people inside the very institutions that are supposed to stop it." Caleb closed the folder. He looked at Emily with those pale blue eyes that she'd noticed the first time she came to him 2 months ago had an unsettling quality. Not coldness exactly, but depth. The look of someone who had seen considerably more of human nature than his quiet life in a Wyoming repair shop would suggest. "You're not telling me this because you want me to read it," he said. "You're telling me this because you want to know if I'm going to do something about it." Emily held his gaze. "Your shop is the last thing standing between Adrian Voss and complete control of the Western Road. If you sell, he builds his entrance. The Veterans Park disappears. The last family businesses become a service road for a luxury casino." She stopped. "My father is one of those families, Caleb. I know who your father is. Then you know what it cost him, what it cost all of them." Her voice was steady, but only by effort. "And you know what it means that you're still here." Caleb looked at the folder for another moment. Then he pushed it back toward her. "Keep documenting," he said. "Every piece of it. Everything you found in Colorado and Nevada and Arizona. Everything that's happening here. Build it complete, build it clean, and build it so that when the right people see it, there isn't a procedural motion in existence that can make it disappear." "The right people," she repeated. "Who are the right people?" "You'll recognize them," he said, "when they show up." She studied him. "You know something I don't." "I know several things you don't," he said, not unkindly. "But the one that matters right now is that you have the most important role in this whole situation, Emily. You have the documentation. You have the pattern. You have the story." He looked at her directly. "Don't let anything distract you from building it." She left. Noah watched her go from the back of the shop, then turned to Caleb. "You know who she is," Noah said. It wasn't a question. "Her father's Pete Carter, hardware store 3rd block west." "I know that. Noah struggled for the shape of what he was trying to say. "She trusts you. A lot of people in this town trust you. And I've been here 18 months, and I still don't entirely know why." He paused. "Not because you're not trustworthy. You're the most trustworthy person I've ever met. But there's something else in the way people look at you, like they know something about you that I don't." Caleb considered him for a long moment. "Do you trust me?" he asked. "Yes," Noah said without hesitation. "Then trust me when I tell you that the things you don't know about me are things I worked very hard to leave in the past. And the reason I haven't told you isn't that I don't trust you. It's that I spent 9 years becoming the man in this shop, and that man is who I want to be." He paused. "Some of the other version is about to come back. I can't stop that now. But I want you to understand that this version, the mechanic, the man who's been teaching you for 18 months, that one is real too. Maybe the realest one I've ever been." Noah looked at him for a long time. "Okay," he said finally. "Okay," Caleb said and picked up the wrench. 3 days after the burning, Adrian Voss's assistant delivered a letter to the shop. It was professionally prepared on heavy cream stock with the letterhead of Voss Development Group. It informed Caleb Morgan that his property had been assessed at $3.2 million and that a formal offer in that amount was ready for his review subject to a response deadline of the following Friday. Caleb read it standing at the workbench. Noah read it over his shoulder. $3 million, Noah said quietly. 3.2, Caleb corrected. That's Caleb, that's a lot of money. It is. What are you going to do? Caleb folded the letter precisely along its original crease and walked to the front counter. He found a pen, turned the envelope over, and wrote on the back, "Mr. Voss, thank you for your offer. My answer is no. C. Morgan." He handed it to the assistant who was still standing in the doorway. The assistant looked at it, then at Caleb. "Sir, Mr. Voss is prepared to negotiate." "That is my negotiation," Caleb said. The assistant left. Noah watched the door close. "He's not going to stop," he said. "No," Caleb agreed. "So what do? We work, we document, we wait." "Wait for what?" Caleb looked at him. "You'll see," he said. What Caleb did not tell Noah was that the phone in the desk drawer upstairs had received 63 messages by Sunday night and over 100 by Monday morning. He did not tell Noah that 2 of those messages were from chapter presidents whose names had appeared in federal documents during a Senate subcommittee hearing in 2007. He did not tell Noah that one of them had driven from Montana to make a phone call face-to-face rather than leave any record on a network, and that the conversation had lasted 40 minutes and covered things that had nothing to do with Redstone Valley and everything to do with how far trust travels when it's been built across 20 years of impossible situations. He did not tell Noah any of this because Noah was 21 and clean and good, and Caleb had been watching him for 18 months with the careful attention of a man who recognizes in someone else the person he could have been if the circumstances of his life had been different. He wanted to protect that. What he also did not tell Noah was the version of himself that lived in the period before Hannah, before Wyoming, before the repair shop and the quiet mornings and the engine grease that had become the texture of his hands. That version had a name that wasn't his own name, the Untouchable. He'd earned it not in a single dramatic moment, but over 2 decades of accumulated decisions, the kinds of decisions that reveal character, the way sustained pressure reveals the grain in wood. He'd been the national mediator of the Hells Angels at a time when the organization was fracturing along lines of ideology and territory, when 3 major chapters were within weeks of open warfare that would have resulted in deaths and federal prosecution on a scale that would have dismantled everything. He'd walked into rooms where men with violence in their histories and weapons on their persons had told him to turn around and walk back out, and he'd sat down at the table and not moved until he'd found the thing underneath the anger, the thing that was always a wound that had never healed correctly, and worked with that instead. He'd negotiated peace between chapters that had been exchanging threats for 18 months. He'd brokered protection agreements for families and communities where the club was the only institution standing between those families and predatory systems. He'd pulled men out of spiral trajectories and pointed them toward lives they hadn't known they were capable of. He'd done it all without spectacular violence, without theatrical power displays, without anything that looked from the outside like what it actually was, which was leadership of the most demanding kind, the kind that requires you to carry everyone else's worst impulses so they don't have to act on them. He'd done this for 20 years. And then Hannah's diagnosis had come, and he'd sat beside her hospital bed on a Tuesday afternoon in March and understood with complete clarity that the life he'd been living was not a life he'd chosen. It was a life that had accumulated around him while he was busy managing everyone else's. And the woman lying in that bed who was going to die sooner than any person should die, and who was still somehow the calmest person in the room, that woman was what a chosen life looked like. He'd buried his vest the week after her funeral. He'd driven to Wyoming. He'd opened the shop. For 9 years, the Untouchable had been a mechanic named Caleb Morgan. And that was the truest thing he'd done in his life. But this was the truth now unfolding. The things you leave behind don't always stay where you put them. Adrian Voss had set that in motion the moment his men arrived with hammers and chains. He'd wanted to intimidate a small-town mechanic. What he'd actually done was send a signal, unintentionally without knowing the language he was broadcasting, to a network of thousands of men scattered across the country who had one thing in common: they owed Caleb Morgan something real. Not money, not loyalty in the transactional sense, something harder to quantify and impossible to purchase. They owed him the versions of themselves they'd been able to become because of what he'd done. And when you owe someone that, you don't count the miles. It was on a Wednesday, 4 days after the burning, that Noah first noticed the riders. He was getting lunch from the diner 2 blocks down when he saw a single motorcycle parked outside the gas station. The rider was sitting on a bench nearby, drinking coffee from a paper cup, dressed in plain clothes with no identifying colors. He was big, maybe 45, with the kind of stillness that comes not from relaxation, but from self-containment. Noah didn't think much of Pud. Thursday, there were 2 motorcycles he didn't recognize on the North Road. Friday, he saw 3 men he'd never seen before having coffee at the diner counter. Saturday morning, exactly 1 week after the burning, he counted 9 bikes he didn't recognize along the 2-mile stretch between the shop and the hardware store. None of the riders approached the shop. None displayed anything identifying. They bought gas, bought food, bought coffee. They talked to local residents with easy courtesy. They helped old Mr. Wheaton load lumber into his truck bed when they saw him struggling in the parking lot of the building supply store, working in practice coordination with the efficiency of men accustomed to physical labor. They were everywhere, and they were invisible, and they were the most disciplined thing Noah had ever seen in his life. He came back to the shop and found Caleb replacing a fuel line. "There are riders all over town," Noah said. Caleb kept working. "I mean, a lot of riders, dozens, maybe more." Noah paused. "They're not wearing colors. They're not doing anything. They're just present." He watched Caleb's hands. "You know who they are." "Yes," Caleb said. Are they? Noah stopped, started differently. "Should I be worried?" Caleb set down the fuel line. He looked at Noah with an expression that was as close as he came to reassurance, not warm exactly, but solid. The kind of look that meant, "I have done the calculation and you are safe." "They are not here to cause harm," Caleb said. "They are not here to threaten anyone. They are here because they heard what happened and they don't believe I should stand alone." He paused. "They are wrong about one thing, which is that I need them. They are right about another thing, which is that presence matters." "Presence," Noah repeated. "When a man with power does damage to a man without visible power," Caleb said, "he calculates that the damage is clean, no consequences, no complications. He hasn't hurt someone important. He's hurt someone isolated." He looked at Noah steadily. "Those riders are correcting a miscalculation." Noah absorbed this. "Who are you?" He said again, quiet this time, not a challenge, a genuine question. "I told you," Caleb said. "I'm a mechanic." "You're not just a mechanic." "No," Caleb admitted. "I'm not just a mechanic." He picked up the fuel line. "But that's the part that's true right now, the part that matters." He looked at Noah one more time. "Trust that." It was the following Tuesday that Adrian Voss appeared in person. He came with 2 men, not the hired intimidation variety from the previous week, but the professional kind men in expensive clothing who communicated authority through restraint. Adrian himself was 45, dark-haired, with the groomed confidence of someone who had never lost a negotiation he initiated. He stepped into the shop as though he'd already decided its dimensions suited his purpose. He looked around. He looked at the engine stand with the partially rebuilt Harley. He looked at the scorched outline still faintly visible on the pavement outside through the open front door. He looked at Caleb. "Mr. Morgan," he said, his voice was smooth, controlled. "I owe you an apology." Caleb set down the wrench. "What happened to your motorcycle was an unfortunate overreach by individuals acting without my specific authorization." Caleb looked at him without speaking. "I want to make that right," Adrian said. "I'm increasing the offer, $4 million, cash settlement, clean transfer, you keep the tools and any inventory on hand." He spread his hands slightly, a gesture meant to communicate generosity. "That is a number that would give you and your apprentice a comfortable future." I'm told you have medical costs from your late wife's illness. We'd clear whatever remains of those as well. The silence in the shop stretched. Noah, standing at the back with a brake caliper in his hand, felt his pulse in his teeth. Caleb said, "You think every man has a price because everyone around you already sold theirs." Adrian's expression didn't change dramatically, but something behind it shifted. A recalibration. "Mr. Morgan, you had 13 owners on this road," Caleb said. His voice was calm, almost conversational. "You put some of them through tax audits. You cut some of their supplier contracts. You broke windows on a Tuesday and sent an insurance adjuster on a Wednesday. You were patient. You were methodical." He tilted his head slightly. "You've done it before." Something crossed Adrian's face. Not fear yet, but the beginning of a question he hadn't anticipated having to ask. "I don't know what you think you've found." "I know about Pueblo," Caleb said. "I know about Reno. I know about Flagstaff." The two men behind Adrian went very still. "What I don't understand," Caleb continued, "is how a man who is clearly intelligent chose to make his next move by burning a motorcycle that belonged to a woman who died of cancer in a town where he'd already bought every other piece of leverage available." He paused. "That's not a methodical decision. That's an emotional one, and emotional decisions are the ones that leave evidence." Adrian's composure was intact, but it was working now. "This conversation is—" "You came here to make an offer," Caleb said. "I'm declining it. The shop isn't for sale. The Veterans Park isn't going to become your private entrance, and the Redstone Crown project is going to face considerably more scrutiny than you've planned for." He looked at Adrian without hostility, without aggression, with only that terrible steadiness. "I'd suggest you use whatever time you have left to make decisions that reflect better on you than the ones you've made so far." Adrian straightened. His voice went cold. "You have 50 employees worth of customers relying on this road. I can make it very difficult for any business on this side of town to receive deliveries, inspections, or permits. I can do that within 30 days. He took a half step forward. "And those riders parked all over my project zone are going to create a public safety issue that brings every law enforcement agency in the state down on this little community before the week is out." "Those riders," Caleb said, "have broken no laws. They're purchasing goods and services from local businesses, and they're sitting on public roads." He held Adrian's gaze. "I'd be very careful about the public safety conversation." Adrian left. He walked out of the shop and got in the black SUV and didn't look back. The moment the vehicle cleared the lot, Noah let out a breath he'd been holding for 3 minutes. "He knows things about you," Noah said. "He's been asking around." "Yes," Caleb said. "What's he going to find?" "Not much," Caleb said. "I was careful, but careful isn't the same as clean, and a man with enough resources finds things eventually." He paused. "That's why timing matters." "Timing for what?" The phone in Caleb's shirt pocket buzzed. He looked at the screen, read something, and set it back in his pocket. "For the next 24 hours, he said, I want you to keep working on the exhaust housing. Stay in the shop. Don't engage with anyone you don't recognize." "Caleb." "Noah." His voice was firm but not harsh. "I need you to do this. Not because you're in danger, because I need you steady and I need you here, and I need to know there's one person in this situation who isn't playing a role they don't fully understand." Noah looked at him. "Okay," he said. "Thank you," Caleb said. He went upstairs to the apartment. He sat at the desk. He picked up the old phone and read the message that had come through. It was from a number he recognized as belonging to a man named Marcus Reeves, who was the president of a chapter that covered 4 states across the Pacific Northwest, and who had once told Caleb at the end of a 3-day mediation that had prevented something catastrophic that he would answer any call from any place at any time for as long as he drew breath. The message said 73 chapters confirmed, earliest arrivals Sunday, full count by Monday morning. Your rules, your call, we follow. Caleb read it twice. He thought about Hannah, about what she would say if she were sitting across the desk right now, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, watching him with those dark eyes that always saw more than he gave her credit for. She would say, "You know what you're doing." And then, because she'd always known him better than he knew himself, "Just don't forget which version of you is in charge." He set the phone down. He picked up a notepad. He began writing specific, detailed, numbered instructions. Rules of engagement that left no room for interpretation. No weapons, no confrontation, no property contact, no communication with law enforcement unless legally required. Full cooperation with all sheriff's requests. Any rider who deviates from any of these standards leaves immediately. He wrote for 30 minutes. Then he sent the document through the network to every chapter president who had confirmed. The reply from Marcus came back in under 2 minutes. Understood and agreed. Sending to all. Caleb sat back. Outside, the Wyoming wind was doing what it always did, which was move through everything and leave nothing unchanged. Down the road, 14 storefronts stood empty or under Voss Development Group ownership. The Veterans Park was overgrown but intact. Morgan Custom Cycles had its lights on. And somewhere out on the dark roads leading into Redstone Valley from the north and south and west, engines were running, hundreds of them, moving with discipline and purpose toward a mountain town where a man named Caleb Morgan had once told every one of them in different words and different circumstances the same essential thing, that who you are does not have to be defined by the worst thing you've ever done, and that the choice to stand for something real, something that belongs to other people and not just yourself, is the choice that tells you who you actually are. They were coming to tell him he'd been right. They were coming because the man who had held them all together for 2 decades through things that would have broken anyone with less quiet in their bones, that man was being pressured by someone who did not know his name. And they were going to make sure that by Monday morning, Adrian Voss understood exactly whose shop he'd burned. Caleb heard them before he saw them. He was already awake when the first vibration reached Redstone Valley, lying on top of the covers in the apartment above the shop at 4:47 in the morning, staring at the ceiling, with the particular wakefulness of a man who has stopped pretending sleep is coming. The sound was low at first, almost below the threshold of hearing, more felt than heard, a tremor in the air that could have been weather or could have been something else. He knew immediately which one it was. He got up, he dressed, he put on coffee and stood at the window while it brewed, looking out at the dark western road, at the empty storefronts that had once belonged to his neighbors at the Veterans Park, where a flagpole stood without its flag because Adrian's construction crew had removed it 6 weeks ago and nobody had put it back yet. He thought today is the day. He poured the coffee, he drank it standing up. By 5:15, the sound had grown, and by 5:30, it was unmistakable. Noah came through the connecting door from his room above the shop's back office with his hair still pressed flat on one side, wearing jeans and a thermal shirt, and stood beside Caleb at the window without speaking for almost a full minute. Then he said, "Is that?" "Yes," Caleb said. "How many?" Caleb drank his coffee. "More than I asked for," he said. Noah turned to look at him. In the gray light before sunrise, his face was young in a way it hadn't looked to Caleb in months, stripped of the careful composure he'd been building since the burning returned briefly to what 21 years old actually looked like, when something completely outside your frame of reference was happening. "Are you scared?" Noah asked. Caleb considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "No," he said, "but I'm holding something I need to be careful with. Same feeling, different reason." The motorcycles began entering Redstone Valley from the North Road first, then the South, then simultaneously from the Western Highway in a formation so organized it looked like something planned by people who had spent serious time thinking about logistics. They rode in staggered columns, maintaining distance, moving at a pace that was deliberate without being slow. Their headlights swept through the pre-dawn gray in long, parallel lines. There were no colors displayed, no patches, nothing to identify chapter or affiliation. Just riders, and more riders, and then more behind those. At the corner of the Western Road and Main Street, where a traffic light had been blinking yellow since the power company stopped sending techs out on Sundays, the lead column slowed and parceled off, half continuing down the Western Road, half fanning into the side streets, with a precision that Noah watched with his mouth slightly open. "They know where to go," he said. "I gave them maps," Caleb said. He set down his coffee cup. "Time to open the shop." Noah grabbed his arm. "You're going to work." "There are transmissions in the bay that need to be done by Wednesday," Caleb said. "Those people paid for the work. Their lives don't stop because ours got complicated." He paused. "Come on." They went downstairs. Caleb unlocked the front and raised the bay door and turned on every light in the shop, and they worked. The sound outside grew and grew until it was no longer sound, in the ordinary sense, but a physical presence, a vibration that lived in the floor, in the walls, in the bones of your hands. When you held a wrench, a sustained chord of mechanical power that the town of Redstone Valley had never produced on its own and would never entirely forget. And then in waves beginning from the north and rippling south, the engines went quiet. Not all at once, in sequence like a long exhalation section by section, until the silence that replaced the sound was almost louder than the sound had been. Noah stood in the middle of the bay with a caliper in his hand and said nothing for a full 10 seconds. "How many?" he said again. Caleb leaned out of the bay and looked up and down the western road. Motorcycles were parked in disciplined rows on both shoulders as far as he could see. Riders stood beside them, arms at their sides or hands in pockets, not moving, not speaking above a murmur, watching the shop and the road and the empty storefronts with the patient attention of men who had decided to be somewhere and were simply being there. "More than 1,200, Caleb said. He stepped back inside. "Probably more. More than 1,200 people rode from across the country for you." Caleb looked at him. "They rode for the town," he said. "There's a difference." Noah set down the caliper. He walked to the shop door and looked out himself, and what he saw in that moment, the long rows of men standing in the early morning light, the scale of the thing, the extraordinary disciplined silence of it, did something to his face that Caleb watched happen and recognized. It was the look of a young man whose model of the world has just been revised in a fundamental way. "Who are you?" Noah said, not as a question this time, as a statement of arriving finally at something he should have asked differently. "The same man I was yesterday," Caleb said. "Go finish that brake job." By 7:30, the town was awake and the phones were burning. Sheriff Dan Pruitt arrived at the shop at 8:05, and for a man whose job required him to manage his reactions professionally, he was doing a creditable job, though his left hand had the slight, overgripped quality of someone squeezing their composure into a manageable size. "Caleb," he said. "Dan, I'm looking at approximately..." He stopped, recalibrated. "I need to know what I'm dealing with." "You're dealing with private citizens lawfully present on public roads," Caleb said, "purchasing goods and services from local businesses, not blocking traffic, not impeding access to any property, not displaying anything that violates municipal ordinance." Pruitt looked at him for a long moment. "I've had 3 calls from Adrian Voss's attorney in the last 20 minutes. What are they asking for? Dispersal order, citing public safety. On what grounds? They're working on that part. Let me know when they find some," Caleb said, and went back to the transmission. Pruitt stood in the doorway for another moment. "For what it's worth," he said, keeping his voice low enough that only Caleb could hear, "I've got every deputy I can put on shift, making sure nothing goes sideways. But I need it to stay clean, Caleb. Perfectly clean." "It will," Caleb said. "Tell your deputies if they need anything, they can ask the riders directly. They'll cooperate with everything." Pruitt nodded once and left. He was replaced 15 minutes later by a woman Caleb hadn't seen before, mid-40s, dark blazer moving with the professional speed of someone from outside Redstone Valley. She introduced herself as Kara Nolan from the Associated Press. "Mr. Morgan," she said, "we received Emily Carter's piece at 6 this morning. I'm trying to confirm," Caleb looked up. "Emily published her full investigation this morning. It's already been picked up by 4 regional outlets." Kara Nolan held her phone out. Caleb looked at the headline, "Developer's Pattern of Intimidation Stretches Across 5 States, Exclusive Investigation." He looked at it for a moment. "I can confirm the motorcycle was mine," he said, "and that the shop is not for sale. Beyond that, talk to Emily." "Can you confirm you're the individual known as..." "I'm Caleb Morgan," he said. "I'm a mechanic. That's everything I can confirm." She asked 3 more questions. He answered none of them. She left to find Emily, who was, as Caleb well knew, standing at the corner of the Veterans Park with a camera and a notebook and a look of controlled professional focus that was doing a good job of hiding the fact that she'd been awake for 31 consecutive hours. He watched the AP reporter approach Emily and thought, good. That's how it's supposed to work. The morning built. By 9 o'clock, there were news vehicles parked at the north end of town. By 9:30, a local television crew from Casper was doing a live segment from the Western Road. By 10, something extraordinary was happening in the restaurants and diners and coffee shops of Redstone Valley, which was that they were running out of food. Riders were buying breakfast, buying coffee, buying anything on the menu. They tipped in cash, tipped heavily, ate quickly, and left without lingering. Some of them wandering past the Veterans Park stopped and looked at the empty flagpole and said things to each other quietly that Caleb wasn't close enough to hear. Two of them came to the shop and asked Noah politely if there were tools available to make a repair to one of the parked bikes that had developed a clutch problem on the road in. Noah looked at Caleb. Caleb nodded. Noah helped them for 40 minutes and refused payment for the labor. One of the men, 40-something hands, like a carpenter, quiet in the specific way that indicated depth rather than emptiness, looked at Noah when they were done and said, "You his boy." Noah blinked. His apprentice. "Same thing," the man said. "You're lucky." Noah didn't answer, but Caleb, working 6 feet away, heard it, and something in his chest did what it did sometimes when he let himself acknowledge the things that mattered. At 11:15, Adrian Voss's attorney filed an emergency injunction in county court to disperse what the filing described as an unlawful assembly constituting a public safety hazard. Caleb received this information from Sheriff Pruitt's deputy at 11:40. "The judge is looking at it now," the deputy said. "The sheriff says to tell you the filing has some problems." "What kind of problems?" "The kind where they listed 6 specific violations and 5 of them don't apply because the assembly is on public right-of-way, and the 6th one requires a finding of imminent danger, which is hard to make when the people in question have been buying coffee and helping old men load lumber." "When's the ruling?" "This afternoon, probably." The deputy left. Caleb went back to work. Noah was quieter than usual. He'd been inside his own head since the morning's first light, and Caleb had watched it happening the way he watched everything attentively without comment, giving it space to resolve on its own. But by noon, it was apparent that whatever was turning over in Noah's head needed to come out, because the young man was putting the same bolt in and taking it back out, and doing it again with the concentration of someone who is physically present and mentally somewhere else entirely. "Say it," Caleb said. Noah set down the bolt. "Those men out there," he stopped. "Go ahead." "I was afraid of them. When I first saw them this morning, I'm not going to pretend I wasn't." He looked at Caleb. "And then I watched them all morning. The man who helped Mr. Wheaton with his truck last week, he did it again today with somebody else's stuff. There's a guy out front who's been walking up and down the road picking up trash he didn't put there. 2 of them helped Mrs. Garcia carry groceries to her car." He shook his head slowly. "I had a picture of them in my head and the picture was wrong." Caleb thought about what to say and chose the simplest version. "Most pictures built from the outside are wrong," he said. "That's not your fault. It's what pictures do." "Who are they?" Noah said. "Really?" "They're men," Caleb said. "Some of them have done things that were wrong. Some of them have histories that would make your hair stand up. And some of them are the most reliable people I have ever known. Not reliable in the way that's easy, not reliable, because nothing hard ever happened to them, but reliable the way iron is reliable, because the heat already happened and they came through it as something stronger." He paused. "They're complicated, same as every person you've ever met, just with less insulation between them and the worst of what the world can do." Noah was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Is that why you stayed with them for 20 years? Caleb looked at him. "That's the first time you have asked me directly." "I know." Caleb set down the wrench. He leaned against the workbench and crossed his arms and looked at Noah with the full attention he rarely directed at any single thing while work was waiting. "I stayed because someone had to," he said, "and because I was good at it, and because the alternative, leaving those men without someone to translate between who they were and who they could be, felt like abandonment." He paused. "I left eventually because a woman showed me that doing something because you're good at it and doing something because it's the life you choose are 2 different things. And she was right." He uncrossed his arms. "Your turn. What is it you're really asking?" Noah looked at the floor. "I'm asking if you're going to go back to it after this." He raised his eyes. "Because I've been here 18 months and He stopped. "The shop matters to me. What you've been teaching me matters. I don't want..." He stopped again. Caleb waited. "I don't want to lose this," Noah said. It came out younger than he probably intended, and he knew it because his jaw set afterward the way it did when he felt exposed. Caleb looked at him for a long time. "You're not going to lose this," he said. "I gave you my word on this shop when I hired you. That doesn't expire." Noah nodded, looked away. "Okay," he said quietly. "Pick up the bolt," Caleb said. Noah picked up the bolt. At 2:15 in the afternoon, Adrian Voss walked into the shop. He came alone this time, which was either brave or reckless, and might have been both. He'd shed the professional composure of his Tuesday visit. It wasn't entirely gone, but it had developed cracks, the kind that appear in surfaces under sustained stress. He looked like a man who had been making phone calls since 6 in the morning and had not liked what he heard on any of them. He stood in the middle of the shop floor and looked at Caleb. "I need to understand," he said, "what you think this accomplishes." Caleb set down the work in his hands. He turned to face Adrian. He did not cross the distance between them. He simply stood where he was, grease on his hands and sawdust on his boots, and gave Adrian Voss his full and complete attention. "You've created a spectacle," Adrian said. "You've brought in over 1,000 people with criminal affiliations to intimidate my investors and obstruct my project. You have no idea what you've set in motion." "Tell me about Pueblo," Caleb said. Adrian's jaw tightened. "That's not relevant." "Tell me about the fire at the Garza family property in November 2019, Caleb said. "Tell me about the tax audit that was opened on Simmons Feed and Hardware 6 days after Martin Simmons publicly opposed your Reno development. Tell me about the 3 offshore holding companies that funded the Flagstaff acquisitions while your primary company maintained clean books." He took one step toward Adrian, just one. "I'll listen to everything you want to say about spectacle after you've explained those things to me." Adrian went still. The practiced confidence had not left his face, but something behind it had shifted in a way that was visible to anyone who knew how to look. And Caleb had spent 20 years reading the faces of men in rooms where something critical was being decided. He was reading Adrian Voss's face right now, and what he saw was calculation running at high speed behind a composed surface, the assessment of options, the triage of risk, the question every cornered man eventually arrives at: how much does the other person actually know? "You're threatening me," Adrian said. "I'm informing you," Caleb said. "There's a difference. 1,000 outlaw bikers surrounding my project is a threat, Mr. Morgan. 1,000 private citizens on public roads is context," Caleb said. "What it contextualizes is the question of who you're dealing with when you deal with me." He held Adrian's gaze without effort. "You came to this town and you looked at a mechanic working in a shop and you made a calculation. The calculation was wrong. Not because I'm going to do anything violent. Not because the men outside are going to touch you." He paused. "Because the thing you didn't research before you burned my motorcycle is the thing that makes everything you've built here come apart." He reached under the workbench and placed a file on the surface. It was thick, organized with the neat coherence of someone who'd been building it for months. Adrian looked at it. He did not reach for it. "Emily Carter has a version of that," Caleb said. "Sheriff Pruitt has a version. There's a third version in the hands of a federal contact who received it this morning." He paused. "And those are just the pieces I know about." Silence. "Every man outside that window would fight for me," Caleb said quietly. "My responsibility is making sure they never have to." Something happened in Adrian Voss's face in that moment that Caleb had seen before in other rooms, in other years, the specific collapse of a certainty that had held someone's entire posture together. It was a small thing visible only to someone looking for it, but it was real. "You think you've won something," Adrian said. "I think you should call your attorney," Caleb said. "Not the one who filed the injunction this morning. The other one, the one you call when things are serious." Adrian looked at him for 3 more seconds. Then he turned and walked out. Noah had been in the back of the shop through all of it, not moving a socket wrench in both hands. He waited until the sound of footsteps faded. "He's scared," Noah said. "Yes. Is that good or bad?" "Depends what a scared man does next," Caleb said. "Scared men with resources and lawyers do one of 2 things. They run or they escalate." He picked up the file and returned it to under the bench. "We need to be ready for either." He was back at the engine within 2 minutes. What happened next came not from Adrian, but from a direction Caleb hadn't fully calculated. At 3:40 in the afternoon, a woman came through the shop door in the particular manner of someone who has been working up to something and finally committed. She was in her 50s, dressed in business clothes that had survived a long day less well than they'd started, it carrying a canvas briefcase, and wearing the expression of a person in the process of doing something that will cost them considerably. Her name was Rebecca Sloan. She was Adrian Voss's chief financial officer. Caleb had seen her name in Emily's documents, but had never seen her face. She looked around the shop. She saw Caleb. She crossed to him directly. "I need to speak with you," she said, privately. Noah looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Rebecca Sloan, at the briefcase, at her hands. "Noah," he said, "take a break." Noah went outside. Rebecca set the briefcase on the workbench. She opened it. Inside were files, printed documents, 2 external hard drives, and a sealed envelope. "I've been with the company for 7 years," she said. "I have handled the financial architecture of every project Adrian has run during that time." She didn't look away from Caleb. "I know where every dollar is. I know which accounts are offshore. I know which insurance claims were fraudulent. I know the names of the county officials who received payments in Pueblo and Reno and Flagstaff and 4 other markets you may not know about yet." She put her hand on the briefcase. "I have everything documented, 3 copies. This one with my personal attorney, and one in a location I'm not disclosing until I have a guarantee of cooperation from federal authorities." Caleb looked at the briefcase, then at her. "Why are you here?" he said. Her composure cracked just slightly at the edges. "Because I knew what it was," she said. "I knew from the second year. I told myself the accounting was clean, the legal exposure was contained, the methods were aggressive but defensible." She stopped. "I told myself a lot of things." She looked at the files in the briefcase. "My brother owned a hardware store in Pueblo. He sold it because he couldn't breathe anymore under the pressure. He sold it for 40 cents on the dollar and moved to Denver and didn't speak to me for 8 months because I worked for the man who did it to him." Her voice held, barely. "He spoke to me again. We're okay. But She stopped. Caleb waited. "I can't undo what I was part of," she said. "I can't give those people their stores back. I can't give your wife's motorcycle back." She held his gaze. "But I can end it." Caleb looked at the briefcase for a long time. "Have you contacted the FBI directly?" he asked. "My attorney reached out to a contact this morning," she said. "Before I came here, they're interested, but I wanted you to know." She paused. "I'm not sure why. I wanted you to know that not everyone in that building was the same as him." Caleb looked at her. He thought about what she had cost herself to carry that briefcase through his door. "Thank you," he said. "It was simple. It was enough." She nodded. She picked up the briefcase. She walked out. Noah came back in 30 seconds later, moving fast. "Who was that?" "The woman who just changed everything," Caleb said. He picked up his phone. He typed one message to Emily Carter. The message said, "Check your email in the next hour. Source coming to you. Treat it with everything you have." He sent it. He set the phone down. The afternoon moved. Outside, the riders maintained their positions with the same disciplined calm they'd held since morning. Local residents had stopped being alarmed by them and started being something more complicated, something that looked like recognition, the gradual revision of a fear into an understanding. A group of veterans from the American Legion post on the North Road walked down at 4 o'clock and stood in front of the Veterans Park for a long time talking to several of the riders. One of the riders, Caleb would learn later, that his name was Vincent, that he'd done 2 tours, that he'd found the club after a period he didn't describe in specifics, went to his saddlebag, and produced a folded American flag. He and the Veterans Post Commander carried it together to the empty flagpole and raised it. Nobody made a speech. Nobody took video. The flag went up. Caleb watched it from the shop door. The day's most decisive moment came not with noise or confrontation, but with a phone call that Pruitt received at 5:47 in the afternoon, the content of which reached Caleb through the deputy who came to the shop at 6:03. "The judge denied the injunction," the deputy said, "and the sheriff wants you to know that he received a call from the Denver field office of the FBI at 5:30 this morning." He paused. "They're sending a team." The deputy left. Noah looked at Caleb. "The FBI." "Yes." Noah searched for the word. "That's big." "That's the end of the beginning," Caleb said. He went back to the engine. Outside, the light was changing, the way Wyoming light does in the late afternoon, going gold and long-shadowed, making everything look both older and cleaner than it actually is. The riders were still there, still in their rows, still present in the particular way that presence communicates what words can't, that this place matters, that the people in it are seeing that there is a cost to treating ordinary lives as expendable. On the western road behind the plate glass of what had once been Pete Carter's hardware store and was now an empty space waiting for Adrian Voss's construction crews, a light still worked. Some timer nobody had disconnected. It turned on automatically as the day darkened and lit up the empty interior, and for a moment it looked almost like the store was still open. Caleb noticed it. He turned back to the engine. The work was not done. The motorcycle was not finished. The town was not safe yet. But something had shifted in the weight of things, the way weight shifts when enough people decide at the same moment to push in the same direction, not because anyone commanded them to, but because they looked at what was happening and recognized it as something worth pushing against. Somewhere on the roads leading out of Redstone Valley, federal vehicles were already turning inward. And Adrian Voss, in his hotel room at the north end of town, was looking out the window at 1,400 riders who had not moved and making the call he should have made a long time ago. Caleb didn't know what Adrian said on that call. He'd find out soon enough. The call Adrian Voss made from his hotel room that evening was to his lead attorney in Denver, a man named Gerald Fitch, who had kept Adrian's name out of courtrooms across 5 states and who charged $450 an hour and had never once in 12 years told his client that he was in genuine trouble. He told him that now. Caleb learned this secondhand, the way most important information travels in a small town through the particular network of people who know people, in this case through the hotel manager's sister-in-law, who was married to one of Sheriff Pruitt's deputies, who mentioned to Pruitt that Adrian's checkout time had quietly moved from Sunday to open-ended, and that 2 of his associates had already cleared their rooms at noon. Pruitt called Caleb at 7:15 that evening. "He's thinking about running," Pruitt said. "He can't run from federal investigators," Caleb said. "He doesn't know the FBI is coming yet." "He will by morning," Caleb said. "Emily's story is running in 3 national papers tomorrow. The moment that publishes, his attorney will know, and his attorney will tell him." He paused. "Is there anything on the books you can use to hold him locally?" Pruitt was quiet for a moment. "The arson on your motorcycle. I've had a forensic report since Thursday. 2 of the masked individuals left partial prints on the fuel tank. We matched one to a man on Adrian's payroll, a contractor named Bryce Cullen, who has done security work for Voss Development in Arizona and Colorado." He paused again longer. "I've been waiting for the right moment." "This is the right moment, Dan." A breath, then, "Give me 2 hours." Caleb hung up. He sat at the workbench in the quiet shop, the overhead lights throwing the kind of hard white illumination that makes everything look exactly as it is. No softening, no shadow cover. He had the old phone from the desk drawer beside him. He'd been reading through messages for the past hour, coordinating with chapter presidents about the morning's logistics, about who needed fuel, about a rider from New Mexico who'd had a medical situation and needed transport to the hospital in Casper, about a dispute between 2 members from rival chapters who'd been managed before it became anything serious. He was doing what he'd always done, the thing he was built for. The thing that had cost him 20 years of someone else's crises so that other men could have lives they chose. He set the phone down. He thought about Hannah. He thought about what she'd said in the garage that last winter. Her hands on the Harley tank. Her voice steady in the way it had stayed steady even when everything else was running out. She'd said, "You gave yourself to those men for so long. What would you give yourself if you had only yourself to give?" He hadn't had a good answer then. He thought he might have one day now. The shop, Noah, the work of fixing things. The town where she'd told him he was the truest version of himself. He picked up the phone again. He typed to Marcus tomorrow morning before anything else happens, "I need to speak to the chapter presidents. Together. Can you organize that?" The reply came in 40 seconds. "Already arranged. 7 a.m. diner on the north end. They're expecting you." He set the phone down and picked up the wrench. There was still work to be done on the transmission in Bay 2, and it wasn't going to finish itself, and the person who needed it by Wednesday hadn't done anything wrong and deserved to have their vehicle returned on time, regardless of what was happening with the rest of the world. He worked until 11. He went to bed. He slept. At 5:30 in the morning, his phone rang. Not the old one. His regular phone. The one with 3 contacts in it, Noah Pruitt and the parts dealer in Billings. It was Pruitt. "We picked up Bryce Cullen at the Hampton Inn on the service road at 2 this morning," Pruitt said. "He had a bag packed and was attempting to return a rental car." A pause. "He's talking." Caleb sat up. "How much?" "Enough. He's identified the other 3 men from the motorcycle incident. He's named 2 additional individuals who conducted the supplier cancellations and the insurance pressure campaign against Pete Carter and Donna Yeager. Pruitt's voice had the controlled quality of a man trying not to let satisfaction become audible. He's also provided a text chain between himself and an individual at Voss Development Group that contains instructions for, and I'm quoting directly here, making the mechanic's situation uncomfortable enough to change his calculations. They used his name. They used the words "the mechanic," which is close enough when you're looking at a text chain that ends with 4 men burning a Harley in front of witnesses. What about Adrian? His attorney called us at 4 this morning. Apparently, Gerald Fitch has enough professional self-preservation instinct to know when his client is better served by controlled cooperation than by flight. Pruitt paused. The FBI team arrives at 9. Caleb said, "All right, one more thing," Pruitt said. His voice shifted slightly, not softer exactly, but more deliberate, the tone of a man choosing accuracy over efficiency. "I owe you an honest conversation about how long I've known about Voss and what I could have done sooner. I want to have that conversation when this is over." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "I appreciate that, Dan," he said. "Let's get through today first." He dressed. He went downstairs and started coffee and stood at the workbench in the quiet shop for 3 minutes with both hands on the surface, not working, not moving, just breathing. Then he picked up his keys and walked the 2 blocks to the diner on the north end. The chapter presidents were already there. 8 men around 2 pushed-together tables, all in plain clothes, all with coffee, all with a particular quality of authority that doesn't advertise itself because it doesn't need to. They ranged in age from late 30s to early 60s. They had between them probably 120 years of decisions made in difficult rooms, and they all looked up when Caleb walked in with the expressions of men who had been waiting for this and were not sure what shape it was going to take. Caleb sat down. He looked at the table for a moment, then at the men. "You came a long way," he said. "You know why," Marcus said. Marcus Reeves was 52 from Oregon, with a gray beard and the kind of hands that had worked construction sites and engine bays in equal proportion. He'd been one of the 3 chapter presidents present at the mediation that had prevented the Pacific Northwest War in 2011, and he'd once told Caleb that he owed him not just peace, but the daughter born the following year, who was named after nobody but existed because of the life that had stayed intact. "You going to argue about it?" "No," Caleb said. "Good," Marcus said. "So what do you need from us?" Caleb looked around the table. These were not men who responded to sentiment or performance. They responded to clarity. "The FBI arrives today," he said. "Everything proceeds through legal channels from this point. What I need from you is the same discipline you've maintained for 3 days. Clean legal, no confrontation, full cooperation with law enforcement." He paused. "And I need it to hold no matter what happens with Adrian Voss, no matter how today goes, even if it goes badly." "It's going to go well," said a man named Thomas at the far end. He was from Texas, younger than most of the others at 38, and he'd known Caleb for 5 years. "Maybe," Caleb said, "but I need the commitment regardless." "You have it," Marcus said. Others nodded. "There's something else," Caleb said. The table waited. "After this is over," he said, "I'm going to ask something of you, each chapter, each network, everyone who came here." He looked at the table. "I'm going to ask you to build something. A legal fund for small businesses facing what happened in here, for veterans, for families being pressured out of properties they built, something that uses the resources in the reach of this organization for something that doesn't require anyone to break the law or risk their freedom." He held their eyes. "I'm not asking you to become something you're not. I'm asking you to add one more thing to what you already are." Silence around the table. Not resistant silence. The thinking kind. Marcus said, "You want us to be the thing they call before they lose everything." "Yes," Caleb said. "Legal resources, contacts, presence when presence matters, the way it mattered here." Thomas said, "That's a serious operation to build." "I know," Caleb said. "I'll help build it, as an advisor. I'm not coming back to the table. I need you to understand that. The shop is my life. Noah is my responsibility. Redstone Valley is where I live." He looked at each of them. "But I can build this from here, if you want it." Marcus looked at the other men. Something passed between them, the kind of communication that happens in groups of people who have known each other long enough that words are sometimes redundant. "Unanimous," Marcus said. "We do it." Caleb nodded. He picked up his coffee. "Now," he said, Let me tell you exactly how today is going to go and what I need each of you to do. He talked for 20 minutes. When he was done, the men left the diner in separate directions, and Caleb walked back to the shop through the early morning light, passing row after row of parked motorcycles and sleeping riders in a town that was, for one specific morning, more full of quiet, disciplined purpose than it had ever been in its history. Noah was already in the bay when he arrived. "You were gone," Noah said. "Meeting," Caleb said. "Who with?" "People I'll tell you about later." He looked at the engine stand. "How's the carburetor housing?" Noah stared at him. "We have 1,700 motorcycle riders in this town. The FBI is coming today, and you want to talk about the carburetor housing." "The carburetor housing belongs to Dale Hutchins, who has a ranch to run," Caleb said. "Dale Hutchins didn't ask for any of this. He just wants his truck back." Noah looked at him for a long moment. Then, despite himself, he almost smiled. "It's about 60% done," he said. "Good," Caleb said. "Let's finish it." They worked. At 9:07, the federal vehicles entered Redstone Valley from the North Road, 4 of them dark and deliberate, moving past the rows of parked motorcycles and riders, who watched them pass in the same disciplined silence they'd maintained for 3 days. The agents inside the vehicles, Caleb would later learn, there were 11 of them, plus a forensic accountant and 2 prosecutors from the Denver, U.S. Attorney's office, observed the riders with the professional attentiveness of people who were also revising a mental picture. At 9:42, Caleb received a call from a number he didn't recognize. He answered it, a woman's voice, precise and unhurried. "Mr. Morgan, my name is Special Agent Diane Torres. I'm leading the investigative team that arrived this morning. We're currently at Sheriff Pruitt's office, and I'd like to speak with you at your convenience today. Not formally, just a conversation." "I can come at noon," Caleb said. "That works. And Mr. Morgan?" A pause. "Ms. Carter's documentation and Ms. Sloan's materials are substantial. I want you to know that we take both seriously." "I know you do," Caleb said. "That's why I didn't call you sooner." A brief silence on her end. "What do you mean?" "I mean that the timing mattered," he said. "If you'd arrived with partial evidence a week ago, Gerald Fitch would have filed 3 motions and buried the case before you found your footing. What Emily built over 14 months and what Rebecca Sloan brought to me 2 days ago, that's not partial. That's complete." He paused. "Now the case can hold its own weight." Another silence. Longer this time. "I'll see you at noon," she said. He met with Agent Torres for 2 hours. He answered every question she asked. He provided the documentation he had, which duplicated in some areas and extended in others what Emily and Rebecca had already given her team. He gave her names, dates, and the sequence of events from the first offer letter to the burning of the motorcycle to Adrian's appearance in the shop on Tuesday. He did not name any of the riders. He did not provide any information about the Hells Angels network or its membership. When Torres asked him directly about the organization, he said, "Those are private citizens exercising their constitutional right to be on public roads. What they do in other contexts in their own lives has nothing to do with what happened in Redstone Valley." Torres looked at him. She was in her mid-40s, direct in the way of someone who had stopped having the patience for indirectness some years ago, and she was clearly a person who noticed things. "You understand I'm curious about you," she said. "I understand that," Caleb said. "A small-town mechanic who documents a multi-state fraud case with the precision of someone who has experience building evidentiary records, who commands the loyalty of over 1,000 people who travel across the country and maintain extraordinary discipline under pressure, who knows how to time the delivery of evidence for maximum prosecutorial effect." She looked at him steadily. "That's an unusual combination of skills." Caleb held her gaze. "I've fixed a lot of engines," he said. "You learn to understand how systems work." Torres almost smiled. "Right," she said. She closed her notebook. "We'll be in touch." He walked back to the shop through the noon heat, passing Emily Carter on the corner of the Veterans Park. She was on the phone, pacing her notebook under one arm and her hair coming loose from its tie. She saw him and gave him a look that contained about 14 different things, simultaneously relief, exhaustion, the particular brightness of someone who knows they've done something that will matter. She held up one finger 1 second and finished the call. Then she said, "Washington Post wants the full series. They're running part 1 tomorrow morning." Caleb looked at her. "Your father know," he said. She pressed her lips together. I called him last night. Her voice changed on the last three words, went slightly raw at the edges. He cried. I hadn't heard my father cry since my mother's funeral. She blinked. He said, she stopped. Tried again. He said he thought nobody was going to fight for him and me. He thought they were just gone. The store, everything they built, just gone. She looked at Caleb. I told him someone fought for it. You fought for it, Caleb said. 14 months of documentation. That's what brought the FBI, not the writers. Not anything I did. Your work. She shook her head. Both. Emily, both Caleb. She was firm about it. You held the line until I could build the case. The case didn't matter without the line. She put her hand briefly on his arm. Don't minimize your part in it. Hannah wouldn't. The sound of his wife's name and her voice stopped him. He looked at Emily. She met his eyes. She's the reason you stayed, isn't she? In Redstone Valley. After she was gone, you stayed because she saw something in this place. And you weren't ready to say it was wrong. He didn't answer, but he didn't look away either. Okay, Emily said gently. She stepped back. Go fix something. I can tell you want to. He walked back to the shop. The arrest came at 4:17 in the afternoon. Caleb heard it secondhand, then saw the footage on Noah's phone at 4:45, shot by a local resident from the sidewalk across the hotel parking lot. The footage showed federal agents in dark windbreakers approaching the hotel entrance as Adrian Voss emerged with Gerald Fitch at his side, both of them moving with the directed speed of men who have made a plan and are executing it, which in this case turned out to be too late, because the federal agents were faster and had positioned better. There was no dramatic scene. Adrian did not run. He stopped when asked, listened to Agent Torres read the charges, and turned to Gerald Fitch with an expression that the footage was too distant to read clearly, but that Caleb, watching, interpreted from body language alone as the expression of a man finally encountering the wall he has been building toward for years. Gerald Fitch said something. Adrian nodded. He put his hands behind his back. The footage cut off there. On the Western Road, the news moved through the riders in a wave that wasn't sound, but was visible, a shift in posture, a collective release of something held and then returned to stillness. Nobody cheered. Nobody made a scene. A man who'd driven from Montana simply turned to the man beside him and said something quiet. The other man nodded. That was all. Noah watched the footage twice, then set down his phone and looked at the ceiling of the shop for a long moment. That's it, he said. He just gets walked to a car. That's how it works when it works, Caleb said. I thought it would feel... Noah stopped. I don't know, bigger. The big things always feel smaller when they finally happen, Caleb said, because you've been carrying the weight of them for so long that when the weight lifts, you mostly just feel the absence. He looked at Noah. That's okay. The absence is good. Noah looked at him. Do you feel it? Caleb thought about the motorcycle on the engine stand, about the blackened frame sections they'd preserved, about the burned leather that had been Hannah's stitching. I feel a few things, he said. Ask me in a week. The riders began leaving that evening. Not all at once, in the same disciplined waves in which they'd arrived chapter by chapter, north and south and west engines, starting in sequence and pulling out in organized formations that moved through Redstone Valley with the same measured purpose they'd maintained for 3 days. Residents came out to watch, some waved, some of the riders waved back. One stopped at Pete Carter's empty hardware store and stood in front of it for a moment looking at the dark window with the light still on its timer. He was tall and broad-shouldered, mid-50s, with the kind of stillness that spoke of things carried long distances. He stood there for maybe a minute. Then he got on his bike and rode. Pete Carter himself was there. He'd come down from his house on the North Road at some point in the afternoon, and he stood on the sidewalk and watched the riders pass, and his hands were in his jacket pockets, and his jaw was set tight in the way of a man working very hard not to show emotion in public, and only partially succeeding. Emily appeared beside her father. She didn't say anything. She just stood next to him. He reached over and put his arm around her. They stood like that while the motorcycles moved past. Caleb watched from the shop doorway. Marcus Reeves was the last chapter president to leave. He came to the shop at 7:30 in the evening, lone, and stood across the workbench from Caleb in the quiet bay. The fund, Marcus said. We're serious, not the way we're serious about things that sound good and fade. He held Caleb's eyes. "The way we're serious about the things that cost us something." "I know," Caleb said. "We need someone to build the structure. Legal incorporation, operational framework, intake process for requests." He paused. "You have someone like that." "Emily Carter knows a civil rights attorney in Denver who's been looking for a vehicle for this kind of work for 2 years." Caleb said. "I'll connect them." Marcus nodded. He extended his hand. Caleb took it. "You should have called us sooner," Marcus said. "Not an accusation, a statement of something true." "I needed to know I could still do it without you," Caleb said. Marcus held his hand for a moment longer. "Could you?" Caleb thought about that honestly. "Probably not," he said. "But that wasn't the point. The point was knowing who I am when I'm standing alone, so that when I'm not standing alone, I'm choosing it." He met Marcus's eyes. "Does that make sense?" Marcus let go of his hand. "It makes perfect sense," he said. "That's why you were always the one who had to be in charge." He picked up his helmet from the bench. "Take care of the kid." "I will. Take care of yourself too." He paused at the door. "Hannah was right about you, you know. Everybody always knew she was right. We just hoped you'd figure it out before something like this forced the issue." He walked out. His engine started. It faded north. Then it was quiet. Noah came in from the back where he'd given Marcus and Caleb space. He stood in the middle of the bay and looked around at the shop, the tools, the engine stand, the rebuilt components of the Harley arranged with the methodical logic of someone who knows exactly where everything goes. "What happens now?" he said. Caleb looked at the engine stand, at the work remaining. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "we get back to it. Dale needs his truck by Wednesday. We've got 3 more bikes behind it." He looked at Noah. "And we need to source a new leather seat for the Harley. I know a saddle maker in Colorado who does original stitching. I'll call her first thing." Noah looked at the Harley frame on the stand, at the blackened sections of metal they hadn't hidden or removed. "Why are we keeping the burned parts?" he said. "We could replace them." Caleb looked at the frame. "Because they're part of what it is now," he said. "You can replace everything and have a beautiful new machine, or you can work with what you have, what's served, and have something true." He looked at Noah. "We're going with true." Noah nodded slowly. He looked at the frame for another moment. "I want to learn how to do the stitching," he said. "For the seat. I want to learn to do it right." Caleb looked at him. "We'll find someone to teach you," he said. He turned off the overhead light in Bay 2, leaving only the work light on over the engine stand, and the two of them stood in the half-lit shop for a moment, in the particular silence that comes after something large has passed through. Outside Redstone Valley was quiet for the first time in 3 days. The Western Road was empty. The Veterans Park had its flag back. 14 storefronts that stood waiting for a resolution that was coming now, slow and legal and real, through federal courts and property reviews, and the kind of accountability that Adrian Voss had spent 15 years building a machine to avoid. The machine had failed. Not because of violence, not because of intimidation, not because 1,000 riders had descended on a mountain town in Wyoming and done the things their reputation suggested they might do. Because a mechanic had kept his hand steady and let the truth build to a weight that nothing could displace. And because the people who loved him in ways that ranged from the profound to the complicated to the quietly loyal had shown up and stood in the spaces around him so that he didn't have to carry all of it alone. Caleb went upstairs. He sat at the desk. He looked at the steel lighter beside Hannah's photograph for a long time. Then he put the photograph in the drawer, gently face up where he could open it when he wanted, and put the lighter in his pocket. Not to carry it like a weapon. Not to carry it like a secret. Just to carry it like what it was, a piece of his history that he'd stopped running from. He turned off the lamp. He listened to the Wyoming night. And in the morning he would go back downstairs and there would be work to do. And he would do it because that was who he was. Not just the mechanic and not just the untouchable, but the man who had finally learned that both of those things could be true at the same time without either one destroying the other. The morning after the riders left, Caleb was at the engine stand by 6. Not because he had to be, not because the work was urgent in the way that the past 3 weeks had been urgent, but because the shop was where he thought most clearly, and there were things he needed to think through, and the best way he'd ever found to do that was with his hands occupied and his mind free to move. Noah came down at 6:40 with 2 coffees and found him already deep in the carburetor assembly, and the young man stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the specific quality of the quiet, The first genuine quiet in 3 weeks before he set the cups on the bench and picked up where he'd left off the night before. They worked for 2 hours without significant conversation. It was Noah who broke it, not because he'd run out of patience, but because something had been sitting in him since the night before and had finally found its shape. Marcus said to take care of myself, Noah said. When he came to say goodbye, he said it to you, but he looked at me when he said it. Caleb set down the wrench. I noticed that. Why? Because he's perceptive, Caleb said, and because you've been carrying more than you've let on since the burning. Maybe longer. He looked at Noah directly. You want to tell me about Laramie? Noah went very still. He hadn't heard Caleb say that name in 18 months of working together. Not once. He'd begun to believe in the particular wishful way of young men who want to leave things behind, that it had simply been set aside and forgotten. You always knew, Noah said. I knew enough, Caleb said. I didn't ask because it wasn't mine to ask. Your work here was real, and who you were here was real, and what happened before whatever it was didn't change either of those things. He picked up the coffee cup. But you've been watching me handle something from my past for 3 weeks. Seems like a fair trade. Noah set down the caliper. He looked at the workbench. I had a boss, he said, at a shop in Laramie. He was taking parts off customers' cars, charging for work he wasn't doing. I found out. He stopped. I told him I'd report it. He told me if I did, he'd make sure I never worked in a shop in Wyoming again. He had connections. Not like yours. His voice was dry about it, just barely, but enough. What did you do? I reported it anyway, Noah said, to the county licensing board. He paused. He made good on his threat. I couldn't get hired, spent 4 months looking before I found this place. He looked at Caleb. You hired me without calling any references. Your references were garbage, Caleb said. But you put that engine back together in the interview in 42 minutes, and you didn't cut a single corner. That told me everything I needed to know. Noah looked at him. Something in his face shifted, the particular release of something a person has been carrying alone for a long time and suddenly doesn't have to anymore. You did the right thing in Laramie, Caleb said, and it cost you, and you did it anyway. He looked at the young man. That's the only thing I care about. Noah nodded. He picked up the caliper. They worked. Dale Hutchins got his truck back on Wednesday morning, 2 days after Adrian Voss was transported to Denver in federal custody. He stood in the lot and looked at it with the particular satisfaction of a rancher, reunited with a vehicle that represents the material foundation of his daily life. And he paid his bill without discussion and shook Caleb's hand and said, Hell of a week. Hell of a week, Caleb agreed. You're doing all right. Getting there. Dale nodded with the economy of a man who says what he means and means exactly what he says, and he drove his truck out of the lot and Caleb watched him go. That afternoon, Emily came to the shop with a printed copy of the Washington Post piece. The headline ran above a photograph, not a professional image, but one shot by a Redstone Valley resident on a phone, slightly blurred at the edges, showing the western road from above, probably from the roof of the hardware store. The road was lined on both sides with motorcycles and standing riders, and at the far end of it, barely visible, was the lit window of Morgan Custom Cycles. Emily set it on the workbench without ceremony. Caleb looked at the photograph for a long time. Your father see this, he said. He framed it, Emily said. The actual physical copy. He framed it and put it on the wall of his living room. She paused. He called me last night. He wants to reopen the hardware store. Caleb looked up from the paper. The properties are under federal review, Emily said. Agent Torres told me this morning that the acquisitions made under coercive conditions are going to be contested as part of the fraud case. It's not certain, nothing is certain yet, but there's a process now, a real one. She met his eyes. Pete might get it back. Caleb set the paper down. What about the others? George and Clara Simmons are talking to the same attorney who's working on the community fund. Donna Yeager said she's too old to restart a flower shop, and then cried for 10 minutes and then said she'd think about it. Emily almost smiled, which means yes. Caleb leaned against the bench. He looked at the paper again, at the photograph of the road full of riders and the small lit window at the end of it. None of this is finished, he said. The case is going to take years. I know. People are going to get impatient. They're going to want resolution faster than the law moves. I know that too. She held his gaze. But it's moving. That's the difference. She picked up the paper, folded it neatly. 3 weeks ago, it wasn't moving at all. She left. Noah came to stand where she'd been standing. She's going to win a Pulitzer, he said. Probably, Caleb said. Are you going to tell her that? She already knows. The county opened a formal investigation into the two commissioners who had accepted payments from Voss Development Group. Both resigned within the week, one through an attorney's letter, citing personal reasons, one in a manner sufficiently dramatic that it occupied the Redstone Valley Courier's front page for 3 days running. Pruitt called to deliver each development with the controlled satisfaction of a man who has been patient in the right direction for the right amount of time. On the fourth call, he said something different. Caleb, the conversation I mentioned, about what I knew and what I could have done sooner. He was quiet for a moment. I want to have it in person. Come by the shop, Caleb said. Pruitt came that evening. He sat on the stool across from Caleb's bench, the one that was technically for customers waiting on minor repairs, and he held his coffee cup in both hands, and he spoke with the deliberateness of a man who has prepared for this and found, in the preparation, that there's no version of it that's comfortable. I knew Adrian Voss's methods were questionable 14 months ago, he said. I'd had two separate business owners come to me with concerns, nothing documented, nothing concrete, but consistent with a pattern. He stopped. I made a judgment call that I didn't have enough to move on and that moving prematurely would damage any future case. He looked at Caleb. That judgment call was partly right, but it was also partly convenient. Because Adrian Voss had a relationship with the county commissioners, and the county commissioners had influence over the department budget, and he stopped again. I want to say I was protecting the case, and that was part of it, but part of it was also protecting the department, and by extension myself. The shop was quiet. I should have found a way to move sooner, Pruitt said. And the people on that road, Pete Carter, the Simmons family, Donna Yeager, they paid for my hesitation. He met Caleb's eyes. I'm telling you this because you deserve to hear it said plainly and not dressed up as something more complicated. Caleb looked at him for a long moment. Why are you telling me? He said. Why not them? I'm telling them too, Pruitt said. You're first because you held it together long enough for there to be something to tell them. He set down the coffee cup. I don't know what that costs a person, holding something like this together, but I saw what it looked like from the outside and I know it wasn't nothing. Caleb was quiet. You're a good sheriff, Dan, he said. Good enough to know when you've been less than that. That's rarer than most people think. Pruitt nodded. He stood. He picked up his cup. The Harley, he said, looking at the engine stand. How long before she runs? 3, maybe 4 more weeks, Caleb said. Depends on the seat. I've got a saddle maker coming from Colorado to do the leather. I want to hear it when you start her up. You'll hear it, Caleb said. Half the town will. Pruitt almost smiled. He left. The saddle maker came the following Thursday. Her name was Jean Mallory, and she was 64 years old and had been making custom leather work in Fort Collins for 30 years. And when she saw the scorched frame sections on the rebuilt Harley, she ran her fingers over them with a professional respect that Caleb recognized immediately as genuine. You're keeping these, she said. Yes, Caleb said. She nodded as if this confirmed something. Tell me about the original seat. Caleb told her. The stitching pattern, the color, the weight of the leather. He told her that his wife had traced the stitching with her fingers in the garage the last winter of her life, and that he wanted the replacement to be close enough to that original, that someone who knew what they were looking at would understand the continuity. Jean Mallory listened to all of this without writing anything down. Then she said, I'll need a week, and I want your apprentice here when I do it. He told me he wants to learn. Caleb looked at Noah, who was trying to appear as though he hadn't been listening from 2 feet away. He's available, Caleb said. Noah spent 4 days learning from Jean Mallory. He was a better student than he'd expected to be, and a faster one, and on the 4th day when Jean let him complete a section of the seat under her supervision, he did it with the focused, still attention that Caleb recognized as the look of someone finding something they're actually meant to do. Jean left on Friday. On Saturday, they installed the seat. Caleb ran his hand over it once. He didn't say anything, but Noah saw his face. The federal case against Adrian Voss expanded in October to include 7 additional counts among them. Wire fraud across multiple states. Money laundering through the offshore holding companies Rebecca Sloan had documented and bribery of public officials in 3 jurisdictions. Rebecca herself had reached a cooperation agreement that reduced her personal exposure significantly. Her attorney had described her cooperation as comprehensive and material, which was the legal way of saying she had given the prosecutors everything they needed. Caleb heard this from Agent Torres in a phone call that lasted 11 minutes. Torres spoke with the measured professionalism of someone who had seen too many cases collapse to allow herself visible enthusiasm before a verdict. But there was something in her voice that carried more confidence than her words. And Caleb had spent enough time reading what people communicated beneath their words to understand what she was actually telling him. "The case is solid," he said. A pause. "The case is very solid," she said. He called Emily immediately after. She answered on the first ring. "I know," she said. "Torres called me 2 minutes ago." "How do you feel?" A long exhale. "Like I want to cry and also immediately start working on the follow-up story and also possibly sleep for a week." A pause. "How do you feel?" Caleb looked at the Harley on the stand. The rebuilt frame, the new seat, the blackened sections they'd kept. The engine that Marcus's mechanic, a man named Dom, who'd driven from Spokane specifically for this task, had gone through with Caleb for 36 hours until it was not just functional, but better than it had been before the fire. "Like something came back," he said. "Not the same as it was, better in some ways, harder in some ways." He paused. "Real." Emily was quiet for a moment. "That's the story," she said softly. "That's the whole story right there." The Community Land Trust was formally established on the 1st of November. It took 2 months of legal work coordinated between the civil rights attorney in Denver, Marcus Reeves, 2 other chapter presidents, and a retired judge in Cheyenne who had spent 40 years watching predatory development practices displace rural communities and was deeply interested in having something concrete to do about it. The trust's first protected property was the Veterans Park in Redstone Valley. The second was Pete Carter's hardware store site held in trust while the federal review of the property acquisition proceeded. The third was a small ranch in Montana that had nothing to do with Redstone Valley, but had come to the organization's attention through the same network that had brought 1,400 riders to Wyoming on a Monday morning, a ranching family being pressured by a timber company using methods disturbingly similar to Adrian Voss's. The trust sent legal resources. They sent contacts. They sent, when necessary, presence. No weapons, no threats, no violence. Just the weight of organized, disciplined, fully legal human commitment applied to the specific problem of powerful people treating ordinary lives as expendable. It worked. On a Saturday morning in November, 3 months and 4 days after 4 masked men had arrived outside Morgan Custom Cycles with hammers and chains and fire, Caleb started the Harley for the first time. He didn't announce it. He didn't organize anything. He simply went down to the shop at 8 in the morning, put on his work jacket, and rolled the motorcycle out to the front of the shop. Noah was already there. He was leaning against the door frame with his coffee, and when he saw Caleb rolling the bike out, his expression moved through several things very quickly before settling into something that was too composed to be convincing, but that Caleb appreciated the effort of. Caleb stood over the motorcycle. He put his hands on the handlebars. He felt the rebuilt frame under his palms, the new leather of the seat, jean stitching, Noah's section visible near the rear, the scorched metal of the frame, sections they'd preserved, still blackened, still carrying the evidence of what had been done. He looked at it for a long time. He thought about Hannah, about the garage and the oxygen tank, and her hands tracing the stitching, about the promise he'd made to build rather than destroy, and the 9 years he'd kept it, and the 3 weeks when keeping it had required something he hadn't been entirely sure he still had. He had it. He kicked the starter. The engine turned once, twice. It caught. The sound came up from below the pavement and moved through the cold November air and filled the western road with something that was not just mechanical noise, but the specific voice of a machine that had survived something, that had been taken apart and put back together by hands that understood what they were doing and why it mattered. Noah made a sound that he would have denied making if anyone had recorded it. Caleb sat on the motorcycle and let the engine settle into its rhythm. He didn't notice immediately that people were gathering. It was Noah who saw it first, a woman from the coffee shop 2 doors down, stepping out with her cup. Then the postal worker who had a regular run along the western road, stopping his vehicle and getting out. Then Ray Kessler, who had started all of this by making a phone call from his truck. walking from the direction of the diner, with his hands in his pockets and his face doing the thing it had done the morning of the burning, except in the opposite direction. Then Pete Carter, who had driven down from his house on the North Road, which he'd been doing every day since hearing that the Federal Review was progressing, as though proximity to the shop helped him believe the return of his store was real and not something that could simply dissolve if he stopped paying attention to it. Then Donna Yeager, then George Simmons, then Clara behind him. Then Sheriff Pruitt, who had apparently received some kind of informal notification through whatever channel that kind of notification moved, and who stood with his arms crossed, and the look of a man who is exactly where he's supposed to be. Then Emily, who had her phone out, not to record video, but to make a call, and Caleb, watching her from the motorcycle, understood immediately who she was calling. She held the phone out toward the running engine. On the other end, Pete Carter, who was also standing 20 feet away in the physical world, flinched slightly when the sound came through the phone speaker, and then he pressed his lips together hard. Emily ended the call. She looked at her father. He looked at her. Nobody made a speech. Nobody needed to. Caleb sat on the motorcycle and let it run for 2 full minutes before he put it in gear and moved. He rode slowly down the Western Road, past the empty storefronts that were no longer going to be empty for much longer, past the Veterans Park where the flag moved in the November cold, past the place where Pete Carter's hardware store had been and would be again, past the places where families had built things and had them taken and were in the long, patient process of having them returned. He reached the end of the Western Road. He turned around. He came back. Behind him, he heard engines. He glanced in the mirror. Noah had pulled out on the shop's demonstration bike a rebuilt Sportster that had belonged to a customer who'd left it uncollected, and he was 30 feet back, riding with the careful deliberateness of a man who has been taught properly and knows it. Behind Noah and probably 3 other bikes had appeared from somewhere residents Caleb recognized, men who'd watched everything and owned motorcycles they hadn't thought to bring out until this moment. They weren't a formation. They weren't organized. They were just people following behind someone, which is what people do when they trust the direction. Caleb came back up the Western Road and pulled into the lot and cut the engine. The crowd was larger now. 40 people, maybe more. Standing on both sides of the lot, the road, the sidewalk in front of the empty stores. Ordinary residents of a mountain town in Wyoming who had watched something difficult and something extraordinary happen in the same 3-week period and were still processing what it meant. Noah pulled in beside him. He cut his engine. He sat on the Sportster and looked at Caleb. "How did it feel?" he said. Caleb got off the motorcycle. He looked at it, at the repaired metal, the new leather, the visible scars in the frame that they'd chosen to keep because they were part of what it was now. Like coming back, he said, not to what it was, to what it became. Noah nodded slowly. He understood that. He understood it in the way you understand something that applies to more than the single thing being described. "Can I ask you something?" Noah said. "You can try. If you could go back to that Saturday morning when they first came with the hammers." He looked at Caleb steadily. "Would you do anything differently?" Caleb thought about this with the seriousness the question deserved. "No," he said. "Not even?" "No," Caleb said again, "because every decision I made from that morning forward was made by the person Hannah helped me become, and that person handled it the right way." He paused. Not perfectly, but the right way. He looked at Noah. "There's a difference." Noah was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She must have been something." Caleb looked at the motorcycle, at the seat, at the stitching that Noah's hands had completed. "She was the most accurate person I've ever known," he said. "She saw exactly what things were, not what she wanted them to be, what they actually saw." He paused. "Including me." "That must have been terrifying," Noah said. Caleb almost smiled. "Every day," he said. Emily appeared beside them. She had her notebook, always her notebook, but she held it closed at her side, the way she held it when she wasn't working, which meant she was here as herself rather than as a reporter. "The Washington Post wants to do a follow-up piece," she said. "Human interest angle. The rebuild of the motorcycle, what the town looks like now, the community land trust." She paused. "They want to talk to you." "No," Caleb said. "I know. I told them no. They asked me to ask anyway." She glanced at the motorcycle. "What I'm going to write instead is the piece about the fund, about what it's doing in Montana, about what it could do in other places." She looked at him. "That's the story that matters going forward." "Yes," Caleb said. "That's the story." She nodded. She looked at the motorcycle for a moment. Can I ask you something, she said. Seems to be the theme of the morning. That day in the shop, when you told me to keep documenting, to build it complete and clean and wait for the right people, she held his gaze. Did you know then that it was going to work? Caleb thought about that Saturday morning. The fire, the crowd, the terrible stillness he'd held while the thing Hannah had touched with her hands burned down to metal. No, he said. I knew what the right thing to do was. I didn't know if the right thing was going to be enough. He paused. It usually is, but not always. You can do everything right and still lose. That's the part nobody likes to say out loud. Emily looked at him. But this time, she said it, this time he said the right thing was enough. Adrian Voss pleaded guilty in January. Not to everything his legal team negotiated down from the full charge list in a process that Torres described to Caleb as typically frustrating and ultimately adequate. But he pleaded guilty to wire fraud, money laundering, and bribery of public officials in 3 states. He was sentenced to 11 years. Gerald Fitch gave a statement about his client's remorse that Caleb did not read because it was not something he needed to read. The displaced business owners in Redstone Valley received notice the same week that the federal review of their property transfers had concluded. Of the 13 properties acquired through coercive methods, 9 were returned to their original owners or their heirs through a settlement process coordinated by the U.S. Attorney's Office. The remaining 4 involved complications in the title transfers that would require further proceedings, but the Community Land Trust had already filed to hold those properties in protective status pending resolution. Pete Carter walked back into his hardware store on a Thursday afternoon in February. The shelves were empty and the floor needed work, and 2 of the windows had been sealed with plywood by Voss Development's contractors at some point in the past year. He stood in the middle of the empty space and put his hand on the wooden counter he'd built himself in 1987 and stood there for a long time. Emily was there. She described it later to Caleb not as a reporter, but as a daughter. And the way she described it, her father's hand on the counter, the empty shelves, the sound of his breathing in the quiet building, told Caleb everything he needed to know about what the Redstone Crown project had actually cost this town and what the returning of it actually meant. Caleb came to the hardware store that evening with Noah, and they helped Pete move the first shelving unit back into position. It was a simple physical task that took 40 minutes. Nobody talked about what it meant. They just did the work because doing the work was the most honest response to what the moment required. When they were done, Pete stood back and looked at the single restored shelving unit in the otherwise empty store. Long way to go, he said. You've got time, Noah said. He was 21 years old and he said it with the easy confidence of someone who understands that time properly used is enough. Pete Carter looked at him, then at Caleb. Good kid, he said. I know, Caleb said. The Harley stayed parked outside the shop through the winter. Caleb rode it on the days when the roads were clear and the coal was manageable, which in Wyoming meant not as many days as he'd have liked, but enough. He rode it the way Hannah had always told him he rode, not like a man proving something, but like a man who is exactly where he is supposed to be moving through a world that has given him grief and grace in roughly equal measure, and has found in the balance of those things something worth continuing toward. On the last day of February, Noah completed his first full solo rebuild. It was a 1978 Sportster that had come to the shop in a state Caleb described charitably as ambitious, and Noah had worked on it for 6 weeks in the hours around the regular repair work, carrying the kind of focused patience that a person only develops when the thing they're doing is the thing they actually want to be doing. When he started it, it ran. Caleb stood behind him and listened to the engine and heard in its sound the specific competence of work done correctly by hands that had been taught well and had taken the teaching seriously. How does it sound? Noah asked. Caleb listened for another moment. Like it was built by someone who knows what they're doing, he said. Noah looked at him over his shoulder. He was trying not to show how much that mattered to him. He was not entirely succeeding. Is that the best compliment you've got? He said. From me, Caleb said, that is the highest compliment there is. Noah turned back to the bike. He sat on it for a moment with both hands on the bars, feeling the running engine through the frame, through the seat, through everything he'd put back together correctly. He looked like a person who has just arrived at something they've been building toward without quite knowing it, and who recognizes the arrival not with drama, but with a deep and solid sense of having been going the right direction all along. Caleb let him have that moment. Then he said, "Shut it down. There's a transmission in Bay 2. Noah laughed. He shut it down. They went back to work. The steel lighter sat in Caleb's desk drawer beside Hannah's photograph. He didn't carry it anymore. He didn't need to. The identity it represented, the weight of who he'd been, the history he'd carried, the 2 decades of other people's crises, and his own extraordinary capacity for holding it all steady, that identity was not something he needed to have in his pocket to know it was part of him. He knew what he was. He was the man who had built something honest from the ruins of something complicated, who had loved a woman clearly enough to let her change him, who had taught a kid from Laramie how to rebuild an engine, and in the process something rather more important than that, who had stood still while something precious burned and then gone inside and started the work of bringing it back. He was the mechanic. He was the untouchable. He was the widower and the teacher and the neighbor and the man who answered calls he hadn't invited. All of those things were true. None of them canceled the others. And the Harley was parked outside his shop, scarred and repaired, imperfect and real running, stronger than it had before the fire, which was the only way it needed to be, because anything that had survived what it survived had already proven something that no amount of polishing could improve. The town survived because its people refused to let fear decide what they were worth. The motorcycle survived because Caleb rebuilt it with hands that remembered every piece. And the man who had once been called untouchable turned out to be exactly that, not because nothing could touch him, but because everything that did touch him, everything that tried to break him, everything that burned and threatened and pressured and took none of it could reach the thing at the center, the thing Hannah had seen, the thing that was always underneath everything else, simply and completely and irrevocably his.